a little bit early. Gonna let a few more people in. There is a certain amount of power, it feels like, when you can let people in, in and out of a meeting. So,
The velvet rope.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so with all that, again, I'd like to, I'm going to stop screen sharing and hopefully say hello to everyone once again. And I'd like to begin our colloquium this morning by introducing you all to Marie Radford. Marie is our department chair for the LIS department at Sky, and she's going to kick us off. So take it away, Marie.
Hello, and thank you, Connie. I want to tell everybody, number one, Connie just successfully defended her dissertation this week. Dr. Pascal.
Dr. Pascal, it's been a long time. Thank you,
Dr.
Marie.
Pascal, so that's really exciting. I'm so happy to be here today on behalf of the LIS department and also obviously the MI program to welcome you to this colloquium today. We have a very exciting program. I will be keeping my introductory remarks extremely brief for that reason. I'm going to tell you that we're also having a banned books event today at 4:30. I will paste the details right into chat if you're interested. It's going to be a readout and a celebration of Banned Books Week. It's my happy honor to introduce our two primary speakers for today. Emil Lawrence, who works at the intersection of library ethics, aesthetics, and reading scholarship. In his current research, he asks how information practitioners are called on to address and counter structural inequalities in print culture. He has recently published the first paper in a two-part conceptual project on diverse books in the highly prestigious and international Journal of Documentation. And so we also have Marc Aronson. Marc has worked as an editor, author, and publisher of books for children and teenagers for over 30 years and holds a doctorate in U.S. history, focusing on the history of book publishing. His most recent books included the co-author Poisoned Water, the story of the Flint water crisis, and more recently, Rising Waters, the story of the Thai cave rescue. So right now, I'm going to hand it right over to Marc.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I want to thank all of you for coming to this colloquium and those of you who will later see it taped, and especially our three panelists. Emil will introduce Dr. Ramdarshan Bold, Dr. Brendler, and Dr. Knox in a moment. But it is a thrill for me to get to converse with this international and highly, highly accomplished panel. And I felt that since the NBA playoffs started last night, I would get to kind of throw out a jump ball that would get us going. And I think our discussion today is sort of framed by a question. And the question is, what do we want books in a library to do? In one way, that's linked to the goal of promoting diversity and fighting for social justice. Where do we go? How do we go past having approved book lists towards action? That is, we want books to serve as forces for social change. How do we accomplish that? So that's one part of, I think, what our discussion will be. But in another sense, in Banned Book Week, there are the opposite questions, not of assisting change, but of harm. As we reject censorship based on hypothetical harms from, for example, curse words or sexual situations or social criticism in books for youth, how do we respond to claims of harm from characters that are said to be stereotypical or insensitive to underrepresented groups? How do we balance these questions of harm? How do we fight for and seek ways of action? And that is sort of the jump ball that I see as perhaps framing our discussions for today. Take it away, Emil.
All right, thank you, Marc. I just want to echo Marc in saying that I am so glad to have this panel here. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us all on this topic of diverse books in theory and in practice. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it means to forge a meaningful connection between those two things, one that's aimed at transformative structural change. So I'm really excited to hear our panelists' opening remarks today, sort of responding to that prompt from Marc. A little bit of less exciting admin. The way we're going to handle this is that each of our three guests will speak for about 5-ish minutes on some sort of aspect or aspects of theory and practice around diverse books. I'll introduce each panelist sort of as we go along. Then once everyone's spoken, Marc will kick off our conversation sort of as a group. We'll talk for really until like a quarter till, and then we'll open the floor to audience questions through the chat. So just a note to our audience, that does not mean that you have to wait all the way until 12:45 to start thinking of questions. Just kind of as they crop up, go ahead and type them in the chat and we'll turn our attention to those in that last 15 minutes. So, okay, I think that's all the logistical stuff. Let's go ahead and get started. First, we have Dr. Melanie Ramdarshan Bold, Associate Professor in the Department of Information Studies at University College London. Her research centers on contemporary authorship, publishing, and reading with a special focus on children's and young adult books. Melanie is also the, that's great. That just keeps becoming full screen, doesn't it? Melanie is also the author of the book Inclusive Young Adult Fiction Authors of Color in the United Kingdom, and she is currently working on a really cool collaborative interdisciplinary project called Adolescent Identities, looking at how YA reflects the realities of minoritized readers. So welcome, Melanie. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased that that big photo of my big face has disappeared now. Thank you for the invitation and that really kind description of who I am, and I'm so delighted to be here today. So my engagement with youth literature is primarily through the publishing industry. I teach on a publishing MA at UCL, and I work very closely with the publishing industry as well, authors, readers, and publishers. So today I'm going to start by talking about all the ways, well actually just some of the ways in which the publishing industry gets it spectacularly wrong when engaging with diversity. So you probably all remember this, but in the early months of this decade that we call 2020, and during Black History Month, Barnes & Noble and Penguin Random House announced a series of 12 classics with covers, but not content, that reimagined protagonists as people of colour. Of these 12, 5 are regarded as children's classics. So The Secret Garden, racist, Treasure Island, Peter Pan, racist, and The Wizard of Oz, written by a racist, and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So the premise behind this really ill-advised initiative was the question, what if your favourite literary characters reflected the diversity of America, while seemingly ignoring that several of their chosen books contained negative depictions of people of colour? So this was, of course, met with considerable criticism, with many industry insiders saying that the initiative appropriated the current demand for more representative literature for its own opportunistic ends. By depicting protagonists of colour, these covers actually give children a false promise of representation. Upon opening the book, readers would soon realise that the character in the colour was nowhere to be found, but instead might be confronted with problematic depictions of people of colour. So this type of corporate multiculturalism, to use the British cultural theorist Stuart Hall's terminology, so capitalising on this current trend for diversity, is not uncommon and is actually quite prevalent in the publishing and wider book industries. So these kinds of practices and general outdated preconceptions and attitudes towards representation obviously have consequences, which are magnified and especially poignant if cultural gatekeepers hold and disseminate them. So as we all know, there's a social and cultural imperative to publish and support inclusive and diverse books. Representational voices in youth literature are important for young people from all backgrounds. Books are multifaceted providing insight into a variety of different lives and culture. And they have an important role to play in holding up a mirror to the world. What they reflect impacts how young readers see them, and not so young. I'm a huge fan of children's YA literature, but it reflects how readers see themselves in the world around them. So as such, children's and YA, the book market and the book industry in general, has the potential to be at the forefront of educating and informing young people about important social issues, including representation. And given how the last few years have panned out, especially in the US and the UK, we need young people to be as well informed as possible. So social justice literacy is an effective and proactive way to prevent the kind of discrimination and inequality from happening in the first place by interrupting cultural norms, rules, and the constructs that support it. And children's and YA literature is certainly one way to bridge these gaps by inspiring, educating, and engaging readers of all ages in a deeper understanding of the lived experiences of all people, families, and communities in our wide and vibrant world. They also help parents and children develop critical literary skills and promote activism around diverse representation in books, media, and culture. So as I said earlier, books that explore issues of racism, discrimination, prejudice, and inequality in a way that's accessible for young people are more vital in our cultural landscape than ever. So the protests and virtual activism by young people that we've seen across the globe is really part of creating a long-term change, and reading has always been a crucial part of this activism. I've seen it certainly in the work that I've been doing with the Adolescent Identities Project. So young people sharing different ideas and different authors throughout history that not only shape movements such as Black Lives Matter, but also allow young people to develop and continue that conversation when these initial actions end. And that's, that is our role. That is our role as gatekeepers, to support this. If we want to address this cultural inequality and the cultural inequalities in children's literature, children's and YA literature at the moment, then it's really important for publishers, educators, librarians, and cultural gatekeepers not just to expand the range of literature not just in cultural output, classrooms, libraries, etc., beyond the pre-existing canon and bestsellers, but also to understand how text and writing is underpinned by ideology and the value systems of a particular time, and how we can challenge that. We all have a responsibility in doing that, no matter what our role in this, ecosystem is. We must therefore critically engage with power and hierarchies in what we're reading, publishing, promoting, and teaching, what we have in our library shelves, what we're promoting for our students and pupils to read. Also interrogate our own assumptions about the world, and thus engender self-understanding, making sure that we and the young people we serve have the critical literacies required to navigate the complex and diverse world that we live in. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Melanie. It's a wonderful way to kick things off. I'm so glad you used this term ecosystem, right? And thinking about, I don't know, I think it's so important, and so important for this conversation in particular, to think about how the library fits into a larger sort of ecosystem, like literary ecosystem or print communication circuit, or whatever sort of language we want to use there. So I'm sure we'll be.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and I used the term book industry specifically, so I didn't use I obviously come at it from a publishing perspective, but I used the book industry specifically because it encompasses librarians, teachers, people that work with children's and YA literature in an everyday basis.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Oh, there's so much. We'll loop back to things, I'm sure. But thank you. For now, let's move on to Dr. Beth Brendler, Associate Professor of Teaching in the School of Information Science and Learning Technologies at the University of Missouri. Beth's areas of expertise lie in youth library services, adolescent literature, and sociocultural and reader response theories. Beth has done really vital research on gendered heuristics for literary response and book recommendation in the context of Reader's Advisory. And her work has appeared in the Journal of Children's Literature, the Journal of Education, and LIS, and Reference and User Services Quarterly, to name a few. So Beth, take it away.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to participate on this distinguished panel. I'm going to echo Melanie and say good diverse literature promotes social justice because it contributes to cultural understanding in a positive way. It explores our differences in an accurate and sensitive manner and shows diversity within as well as across cultures. Well-written and illustrated books that portray the humanity of cultures allow the reader insight into the many viewpoints that exist within any group. In addition, books written by diverse authors offer counter storytelling. This provides readers with perspectives of those that have been sanctioned, outside of those that have been sanctioned by the dominant culture. Now, how do we move beyond just buying and displaying diverse materials? There are many ways librarians as institutions contribute to the marginalization of non-dominant groups. This includes selection, programming, policies, labeling, attitudes, and even the language used to organize information. We have to recognize that libraries are not neutral. Selection and policy making are influenced by the values and assumptions of library decision makers, and many of those decision makers are white and middle class. Most often, members of the dominant culture decide where libraries should be located, excuse me, what should be in the library policies, what should be in the collections, the kinds of programming that should be offered, and where funding should be concentrated. We say we want to have diverse collections and services, but do we really have them? Who's excluded when we decide on our programming? Who's targeted by our policies? Do we have preconceived ideas of why members of a certain culture or socioeconomic status don't use the library? Whose voices are being privileged in our collections? Who's silenced by our material selection? And what are we validating as knowledge worth knowing? We can't just represent those that we believe are in our service area. We must offer opportunities for our patrons to visit many cultures through our collections and services, and to avail themselves of multiple viewpoints on issues. It's more than what we own. It's what we do with our collections and services and how we address our own biases. We need to recognize that access to information in our society is not freely given. It's dependent on social and financial power. If libraries truly hope to offer free and unfettered access to information, we must look outside of our own boundaries and assumptions. We must eliminate the essentialist notion that there's a certain type of reader or user based on gender, race, culture, socioeconomic status, or other labels. Everyone has many intersections of these sociocultural factors. We should acknowledge that our communities are made up of many types of people, even if we don't see them. We must look at how our assumptions and biases have contributed to structural inequities and work to advocate for change. In order to move beyond bias, we have to be aware of our socialization, the things we view as common sense, inevitable, normal, and natural. They may be invisible to our conscious mind. Often these cultural models or invisible socialization marginalizes groups in society or perpetuates the oppression of certain populations. We can't fight back against those models until we can begin to see them. Once we're able to recognize the thoughts that come from our socialization, we can actively interrogate them. It's essential that we take time to be reflective and introspective so we can begin to change these deeply ingrained beliefs. This kind of change takes time and active deconstruction of our ideas. But each time we question the validity of a common sense idea, we're taking a step closer to recognizing our own biases. Once we recognize the role we play in institutional inequity, we can advocate for change more effectively. Bias and assumptions are also the basis of self-censorship. It's the most insidious kind of censorship because it's so difficult to recognize. Self-censorship affects selection, outreach, choices of programming, displays, and policies. How many of you have chosen not to select good materials because you fear retribution from your administration or the public? Would you shy away from offering an LGBTQIA story time because of worry about parental reactions? Would you avoid diverse, social justice-oriented titles for a teen book discussion group because you're concerned that the attendees or their caregivers will be uncomfortable if the group talks about racism, sexism, or other social inequities? These responses are based on an assumption that you'll have to deal with pushback rather than an actual challenge or complaint. In addition, it stems from your personal values and views of what might be considered problematic by your community. When a group or person openly challenges materials or services, the library can refer to policy and gather resources to support their choices. Self-censorship allows for no such dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. Oh, I was just scribbling things down during that. Things I want to come back to, but yes, this notion, I love that you touched on this notion of sort of what your community, who is in your community, and how that sort of conceptualization might facilitate these sort of gaps and silences if you're not thinking about who's not, right, who is in fact not being served by the library or not using the library. And I definitely want to come back to critical programming. I think there's a really nice connection there to what Melanie was saying about social justice literacy and critical literacy that we can kind of, maybe we can flesh out and get into our chat. So thank you so much. Whoops, I don't want to mute myself there. Let's continue on. So finally, we're going to hear from Dr. Emily Knox, Associate Professor and Interim Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois. Emily's research focuses on information access, intellectual freedom and censorship, information ethics and policy, and the intersection of print culture and reading practices. She's also the author of the book Banning in 21st Century America, and recently edited an anthology on trigger warnings. So we're especially grateful to have Emily here during Banned Books Week. I know this is a really high demand week for you, so thank you for joining us. And I'm looking forward to hearing your opening thoughts.
So in true Emily Knox fashion, I didn't write anything out, but I thought I would talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done on banning of diverse books. So after looking a bit at banning as a broader issue, I decided to take a look at some of the books that have been on the most recently banned book list. So ALA puts out this list every year. This year in 2019, 8 of the 10 books are what we would call diverse books. They have been the same for quite some time. Let me just say what the list is. So I have it written here. So it's George, Beyond Magenta, Sex is a Funny Word, Prince and Night, I Am Jazz, Drama, and my favorite, and Tango Makes Three is still on there yet again. So I really wanted to see more about what are the reasons that people give for banning diverse books? And I found 2 common themes in there. One is really unsuitable for age group, and another is what I'm going to call the problem of the single story. So unsuitable to age group basically means that because books about diverse people are often dealing with trauma in some way, they're therefore not suitable to their intended audience. One way you might think about that, and I have a lot of different thoughts about what that is. Well, first of all, if you are part of a marginalized group, you will almost inevitably have trauma as part of your story. But I also think that this is a problem with the publishing industry as a whole, in that often books about diverse people, in fact, often deal with trauma. As if, and this leads to the second part, which is the problem of the single story. This can also be approached in several different ways. So I'll tell you some of the examples I saw. I would say things like, in instead of reading I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, we should read Gifted Hands by Ben Carson. Now, those are completely different stories, topics, types of literature. One is nonfiction, the other is fiction. They take place in totally different areas. It just so happens that both of the people who wrote them are Black. But it's as if you are a Black person in the United States, you share this story, and therefore, instead of reading one story, you can just substitute another story for understanding how Black Americans. This is just seen throughout, and this is true of most of the challenges to diverse literature, except literature about LGBTQIA. There, it's really that it shouldn't be discussed at all. So it actually, you have to think more carefully about what do you mean when you're saying diverse? Who is diverse? Who are you talking about? Because in fact, there are different arguments used in different ways. I actually feel personally that this idea of the single story is one of the most insidious ideas that we see right now. I'll just tell anecdotally, when I was growing up, I come from an upper middle class Black family. There was nothing. There are no stories about upper middle class Black families. There were stories about urban youth. We even have to think about our term, which is the term urban youth. What do we mean? We mean Black people in the city, sometimes brown people in the city. What about people who don't live there? I know there are more and more books that talk about people who are minorities who do not live in the city, but they're very slow in coming. And it's really this mirror aspect. My concern is often with the book industry is that the people making these decisions, in fact, are often white women who are gatekeepers, and therefore you have your own limited idea of what the stories should be. One thing I talked about sometimes is thinking about what do we consider to be legitimate literature. So often what we call urban fiction, for example, is not included. So self-published urban fiction would not necessarily be collected in many public libraries because it's not considered to be good, even though it is an actual reflection of the people who are writing. So I think all of these things to come together. Emil and I have talked before about like awards, and I know Emil is working on an article on this. I think it's so important to think about how issues of taste and our own understanding of society come into play when we think about something like diverse books and what diverse books do and who they are for. So those are my opening remarks. I'm excited to hear what people have to say.
Thanks so much, Emily. Yeah, you've tapped into a question that I think about a lot, this question of what we mean when we say diverse and when we talk about diverse books. And that I think also loops back to this, the anecdote that, or the story that Melanie was telling about this diverse books campaign, right? With the covers that simply sort of rebranded books as though they were diverse, and how you get that kind of corporate appropriation, perhaps in an environment where we have multiple diffuse meanings, I suppose, being leveraged at that term. But I think I'm going to pass the baton actually to Marc, so you can kick things off.
Sure. I mean, there's so much that everyone said. I feel like we could spend hours and hours on everything that each one of you has raised. But I'm going to cheat a little bit because you all three touched on a topic really dear to my heart. But I also kind of want to challenge each of you in that I think this discussion in print and whenever it's had is 1,000% about fiction. it is as if nonfiction didn't exist. And what's fascinating is that if we're talking about social justice, if we're talking about how to act in society, how to have your voice heard, how to develop information literacy skills, how to see yourself as a person who makes change, if we're talking about authenticity and not just a single story and the representation of how many different lives all of us lead, to me, it seems obvious that nonfiction is a channel for all of that. And yet, for some reason, it's as if it didn't exist as a part of what we need to consider. So being unfair, and because I have the mic, so to speak, I would like to ask each of you, where do you see, youth literature means 0 to 18. I mean, it's a huge spectrum. But what role can nonfiction play? And to get back to, I think, what Beth was saying about biases, why has it been invisible? Why haven't we raised the question of, if we're going to have a library where we want people to learn about how they can be active in society, how they can parse fake news, how they can be information literate amidst the flood and chaos of the insanity of a rabid president on TV, isn't nonfiction a tool? And if it is, why is it invisible? So I take advantage of my place.
So actually, I can respond to that. So I think that nonfiction works differently because it's a way of, because the interpretive mechanisms that people use for those texts work quite differently than they do for fiction texts. I actually think it's not too difficult to find nonfiction for children and youth that celebrates diverse people. Unfortunately, it's often great people diverse fiction. So lots of biographies about great scientists. I had plenty of those. I actually had plenty of those as I was growing up. Nonfiction that deals with structural issues is much more difficult to write for children, but in fact, I would say that in textbook wars, that's where you see those. People challenge textbooks all the time, often because they are willing to speak out about the horrors of slavery, colonialism, all sorts of issues. The textbook publishers do not like to invite that kind of challenge, and so they often take those issues out. So I would say that
that gives us room in the library, because you're not going for an adoption across a class.
That's true. I'm not sure how many libraries actually collect textbooks. So that would be my thing, is that the interpretive issues are a little different.
Well, I think that nonfiction is very important. To me, particularly narrative nonfiction, which I think really tells the story, hopefully an accurate story, of different people. I think we're seeing more and more of it. I think we're seeing more nonfiction that actually talks about, for example, Black Lives Matter, and certain issues of institutionalized racism in our society. I mean, we don't have a plethora of it, but we do have some of it. And I think it's very important in terms of textbooks. I think you have to supplement the textbooks with the nonfiction, because textbooks are telling, a specific story. They generally try to go for the least objectionable story. So it's really important for us to supplement all of that with both fiction and nonfiction. I don't know, did I answer your question or okay?
I can talk about it from a UK perspective. So in the UK, sort of similar to what Emily was saying about who gets prominence in nonfiction. So we don't really have that much non-fiction about the UK or, you know, British people. A lot of the non-fiction that we have, and particularly those that deal with issues of social justice, etc., are brought over from the US. So we have a lot of we have a non-fiction books dealing with social issues are typically imported from the US, or we have a lot of books dealing with other cultures as well. But what I've seen, and I know this is sort of diverging from your point a wee bit, but in the UK, there's been a rise in historical fiction that's like sort of closely linked to non-fiction. It seems to be growing in popularity, especially that's non-fiction that's linked with the national curriculum in the UK. Because obviously there's publishers want to challenge you know, these social norms that, well, they want to challenge. They're trying to speak to broader societal concerns, and they're doing this through non-fiction, historical fiction, rather than doing it through non-fiction. We don't actually have, you know, that many non-fiction books that challenge empire, for example, in the UK, but we have a growth of historical fiction based on real life events that sort of challenge these notions as well.
And
Thank you
public
all.
broadcasting here in the United States. Never mind. Sorry.
But Emil, do you want to sort of, I sort of hijacked this, so do you want to kind of respond to what everyone said and lead us somewhere?
Ooh, that's a tall order, perhaps, to lead you all somewhere. I sort of want to come back to this topic of authenticity. In fact, this, especially because Melanie's talking here about historical fiction, and I know there are quite a lot of disputes around in the just my own corner of this in the romance community around sort of like authenticity and historical romance and sort of who you can write about and who can get a happily ever after in that as is sort of required by the genre in that corner of it. So I suppose I was curious whether there were larger disputes like that around historical fiction and representation in the UK, and I'm also curious if we can perhaps comment on this concept of authenticity and what on earth we mean by it. Is that?
Who do you want to start with?
Well, we can start with Melanie on historical fiction before we get into the big question.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose, and I really want to come back to Emily's point because I was nodding very furiously while you were saying it about the types of narratives that Black and brown people are allowed to write, and it's typically about, you know, discrimination, racism, trauma, etc. And the same goes for the UK. There was a very high-profile case in the UK where a very young Black British author got a £1 million book deal. And it's a book about race and racism, and that was unprecedented, the book deal. But so going back to historical fiction, we have a spate of middle grade novels about historical fiction coming up, and it's really interesting. So Alex Wheatle, who is a Black British author, he's got a book coming out called Cane Warriors, and it's really interesting because it takes this traditional 19th century boys' adventure stories and uses it to ask questions about the historical past of the UK. So there's real life figures in it who've taken part in military operations against the British. And it's just a really interesting way to look at history from other side, this type of history that's been untold, certainly in the UK. And another author that's doing it really well, I think, is Catherine Johnston. She writes really brilliant historical fiction, particularly about voices that are not heard, typically Black British characters. So she's written a book called Queen of Freedom, which tells the story of Nanny of the Maroons, who in 1976, I think it was declared a national hero in Jamaica. And because she led the Windward Maroons in guerrilla warfare against the system of slavery that was enforced by British colonial rule. And so that we're starting to see these really interesting anti-empire narratives coming out of the UK at the moment, which we haven't, I mean, I certainly didn't see any of this during my childhood, which was spent reading Enid Blyton. So you can see how far we've come in the UK in terms of authenticity and the different types of voices that are being sort of showcased now in historical fiction. In terms of authenticity, is there anything more that you wanted me to talk about in terms of the own voice movement or anything like that?
Yeah, I suppose what I'll say is this. I sometimes struggle with the concept of authenticity, sort of not on its face. I've had this conversation sort of every year that I have a reader's advisory class. We work on trying to like hammer out what we mean by diverse books at some point, usually with a few like example titles. We've done it with chic romances, most recently with like, American Dirt, right? Asking whether that counts. It's a fun conversation. And I've noticed a shift, which is initially there was sort of this embrace amongst, I mean, this is very anecdotal, but students would talk primarily in terms of kind of mere inclusion, right? That there was like some representation of some kind of hazy group set of clusters of people. Like there was no sort of like, they wouldn't initiate talk about like oppression or marginalization, but they sort of had a hazy notion of inclusion. It shifted more now towards, well, no, it has to be authentic, right? Yeah. There has to be some authentic representation. And I certainly understand the impulse towards that, but I'd be interested just to hear, maybe we can flesh out conceptually sort of what that means.
I see that Emily's written, I use the one from We Need Diverse Books, and that's certainly the definition that I use when I'm talking about diverse, because typically in the UK, when we talk about diverse books, it means books by and about people of colour, and I find that really othering. So there's a bit of a movement to stop using diverse in that respect. So that's, you know, when we talk about diverse in the UK, it usually means books by and about Black and other people of colour. But in terms of looking at diversity in the broader sense, I tend to use the We Need Diverse Books. But just coming back to Emily's point about the different types of narratives, I think that's what, you know, true diversity is showcasing, because obviously people of colour are not one monolith that, you know, we all have the same experiences. So I think realistically it's just showcasing that really broad variety of experience, which nobody from one particular ethnicity or community can be the spokesperson for. You know, they can't be the one that tells all the stories.
You know, there's a really wonderful book called Stories Matter that is it's a variety of essays about authenticity and accuracy, and the whole idea of who is allowed to tell your story. And the seminal article by Jacqueline Woodson where she says, if you haven't sat at my table, if you haven't heard my family crying, you don't get to tell my story. That's a very brief synopsis of what she's saying. But there are other authors who are saying, is it censorship to tell me that I can't write about thus and such because that isn't in my background? Susan Guevara, who wrote and illustrated the Chatto series of picture books, she says that she was asked to illustrate those. Maybe she didn't write them, she just illustrated them. She was asked to illustrate them because of her last name, but her family grew up with German traditions rather than Latinx traditions. And so she was saying that she did all sorts of research on the barrio in order to illustrate those. So her point is, just because you have a certain last name doesn't mean that you're authentically part of that culture. So anyway, it's a wonderful book of essays that I highly recommend, and different authors and theorists are talking about it in all different ways. But it's really hard to say what is authentic.
So I'd like to respond to that, actually. So I think that it is censorship to tell people what they can and cannot write, just plainly. my question is always, why do you want to? Why would she say yes to that? She should give the opportunity to a Latinx illustrator. Why do so many white people want to write these stories? Write stories about white people. It's okay, you know? I just don't understand this drive, right? And this is actually when we talk about things like privilege and what it means to get rid of privilege, it actually means giving opportunities to other people and being willing to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I can, it is, you know, like you can write whatever you want, but is it the right thing to do? Is that actually ethical to do that? Is that a choice you should make? I just don't understand why people want to do this. It's part of like the privilege of being white, essentially.
I'm just going to back Emily up there. There are so few people of color and other marginalized groups. If you look at the percentage of authors, children's and YA authors being published each year, such a small percentage are Black and other people of color and from other marginalized groups. So until they're, you know, that's balanced out a wee bit, you know, give the opportunities to the people who actually haven't had those opportunities before.
I'd like to add, I'd say two things here. One, I think the problem is partially how we phrase this discussion. If it's phrased in terms of authenticity, then it's a question of accuracy. Could the author, quote, get it right? With enough research, perhaps or authorial skill, you could perhaps get it right. That's different from a question of opening up the gates to more authors, more support, more affirmative action, more giving more opportunity. And I think we've blurred the issue as if to say, I can stamp this accurate or inaccurate, and that becomes the argument, rather than saying we really need to take actions to expand the pool of who's going to tell what. I would complicate it a little, though, Emily, because I don't know that stories are quite as simple or as linear as that. In other words, I lived in a white world and went to school in Harlem. My school life was mixed. And I think how you experience the world isn't necessarily completely fit within a category. So when you think about what you want to explore, it isn't necessarily so clearly delineated as one category or another category.
I think my question then would be, though, but therefore, should you write a book about a Black person who goes to school in Harlem, right? It's one thing to write a story about, I'm not sure of your ethnic identity, but like
Jewish,
about you as a Jewish person going to a school in Harlem. That's very different.
Sure.
And so,
I agree. But and I don't write fiction, but if I did, it would involve me playing a lot of pickup with everybody, because that's what happened. But the other thing, I just wanted to add one other thought for everybody in our community who's here. I think part of the problem is the pressure on a librarian to decide, is this authentic? Is this not authentic? What should I do? And part of what I think we need to do is open up libraries as places for debate and discussion, where you can have voices to talk about what's in this book, what's good, what's bad, who do we want. And I don't think we have to have perfected policies of certified good, certified bad, but rather to have sort of the comments Emily just made around a book and engage in that with young people. And I think that's a positive action a library can take to debate books rather than just simply affirm good book, bad book.
And really, how could a librarian know, particularly because we're by and large white middle-class females. So, you know, I think the most important thing is to have good literature, or what do I want to say? literature that presents humanity. But I also understand Emily's point, which was actually Jacqueline Woodson's point, which was, why do you want to write my story? And it makes perfect sense. But we are faced with this question of, I don't think there is a single answer to it. And that's why I liked this particular book of essays, because it dealt with all different viewpoints on it, which is really helpful, especially when I give it to my students and they can see different perspectives. So,
what was the title of that again? The essay collection?
Stories Matter. Mark, did you write an essay for that?
The short answer is I don't remember, so probably not.
Okay, I thought you might have been in there, but I could be wrong.
I may have been.
I think we wanted to open the floor to audience questions now. So folks can type, or we actually can unmute you as well if that's easier.
Victoria Sun has a question.
Yes, I'm looking at that right now. So
you want me to read it?
Yeah, go for it. You got it there.
Well, actually, Victoria, where are you? Well, it's too hard to find her. I'm afraid we've got a lot of people on this call, so I'll just go ahead and read it. Victoria asks, Becky Albertalli, the author of Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda, was criticized before recently coming out because she described herself as a straight white woman, while Simon is about gay teenagers. Criticism ranged from accuracy to, as we're currently talking about, the claim that Albertalli has taken a spot space from an author who is openly out. How do you guys, meaning the panel, see questions about authenticity related to sexuality versus questions about authenticity related to race? What is the role of the publishers versus authors versus booksellers versus librarians when it comes to gatekeeping and deciding what is or is not authentic enough? And that is quite a question.
I mean, I have thoughts. I always have thoughts, I guess.
Take it away.
So I think there's a couple different contexts to think about this, right? There's plenty of slash fiction that is written by straight white women about gay men. That's its own context of thinking about like who has an authentic voice. So you have to move it into this issue of publishing and YA. Because do we see those as being inauthentic, right? I'm not sure we do. This question doesn't even come up when we think about that type of fan fiction. I would say for something like this, I do think there's a question of authenticity when it comes to race and sexuality. I don't think you can just ignore that. I don't know why exactly the publishers of the book decided to publish this book and not another one. That's the entire black box that we get into, that what else was coming through that they said no to and they said yes to this. That's where everything is unclear. I think when it comes to booksellers can sell what they would like. I would ask that librarians have other voices on their shelves. I always encourage my students to think about representation, not necessarily balance, but Simon was a very popular book. It became a movie, if I remember correctly. So there'd be no reason to be like, I'm never having that book on my shelf, right? But what other voices do you have on your shelf? Do you display them at the same time? When you give book talks, do you talk about the problems with this book? Do you offer other books? So there's kind of different layers of thinking through the problem. It's not as easy as just this versus that. But also, if I met her, I would say, why did you want to write this book?
But I would ask, I think there's a hypothetical there that I'm not sure I accept. Which
I feel a bit sorry for Becky Albert. I feel sorry for her. I think nobody should have to out themselves. And I understand your sexuality develops, and it might not be something that you can identify when you're 15, 16, 20, 25, and it can come out when you're you're in your 30s. So I do feel really sorry for the backlash that she's faced in terms of that. But just going back to Emily's point a wee bit, I think again, yes, if Becky Albertelli, if she was having these experiences and she sort of subconsciously, and this is why she was writing her book, that's absolutely fine. But again, it's the responsibility of the publisher to say, okay, we've got a seemingly heterosexual woman writing these books. Why are we, yeah, exactly. Who are we overlooking? And just having that as the one book, the one LGBTQIA plus book, and I think Emily's right. That's where the problem lies. It's having, in the UK, your one Black author, one gay author, one transgender author, etc. Instead of just having these spokespeople for these particular communities, just publishers have a responsibility to look for more experiences and voices, etc., rather than putting all the responsibilities on, Angie Thomas or Juno Dawson in the UK or Becky Albertelli as well. I think it does definitely come down to publishers knowing the market and understanding.
But I guess I want to push back a little bit, because first of all, you guys have hypothesized that the publisher had a pile of other manuscripts by people who qualified that were rejected for this one. And I guess the second thing is there is such a thing as A, aesthetic skill, and B, track record. And so I think a publisher is looking to some extent at how well known she is and how well she's sold. That is structural. She's had advantages, but the fact is, when a publisher is a business, it's looking at, can I sell this? Well, I have a good shot because she sold well last time. Now, then there's aesthetics. Does she write well? Do I think this is a well-written example? And I don't know that identity. I have another manuscript here by a person who fits that description, inherently trumps either aesthetic skill, here we're talking about fiction, and or track record. To say that we should absolutely seek more and more and more voices of all sorts, yes, but I don't think it's fair to say, because in theory there might have been another book that was rejected, or because we can say there are a lot of people whose actual experiences match this book who would like to write, does not, to me, inherently mean this book by this accomplished author with this track record shouldn't have been published. That seems, I guess, to me, unrealistic to how publishers make decisions. And
my argument is not that it's, my argument is not that it's fair. I actually think it's unfair. I actually think that it's more likely that the publishers would publish her book because she is more similar to them.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And I think the publishing paid me conversation showed that there is a huge disparity in what debut authors. So if anyone was following the hashtag publishing paid me conversation, that showed the huge disparity in what Black authors and other authors of color were getting in comparison to their white counterparts. So debut authors who had absolutely no, showcase of their previous sales and work were getting far, far, far more than a lot of mid-list authors. N.K. Jemisin, for example, one of the best science fiction writers of all time. So who has a body of work and 3 Hugos. The only person that has won 3 Hugos.
Yes.
I mean, what $25,000 in advance for each one of the trilogy, in comparison to a lot of authors who are getting 6-figure deals, debut authors who are getting lots of 6-figure deals. So there has been research that has shown that editors are more likely to publish authors who have a similar background to their own. So yes, exactly. So if these authors are publishing outside of their lived experience, then they're still more likely to get published because they connect to the editor on a sort of demographic basis.
So I do want to address this one question about having a trans son who's disappointed that most trans characters in books are MTF, not FTM. So I would say that you should encourage your son to write the book and you could co-author the book with your son. That's what Jazz did. And I think that's one way of getting voices out. And then I would encourage you to write a book about having a son who is who's trans. I think that that's really how we get to authenticity. I think that's why I Am Jazz's book is so important. It's written in her voice.
Mm-hmm. I feel very young. I'm going to interrupt this because it was my question. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry for barging in verbally like this is just faster than typing. But my son is not, he's, I guess I would say, an atypical student. He's a teenager, but he is very antisocial. I think he may be on the spectrum, which he has chosen not to be, but he has also learning disabilities. He's not, I feel like he wouldn't be able to write an authentic voice, which sounds terrible because obviously he can write his story about his transition. He absolutely could do that. But in terms of like his interaction with the community, I feel his sole interaction really comes from media, from books that I read with him because of his reading disability. I still read to him every night, and we enjoy a wide range of books, TV, other media that he gets. So I feel like, you know, that is a fantastic idea. I feel like if he was actually more involved in the community and could give more of a voice of what that experience is like. But I feel like I would need other voices beside, in addition to his, you know, that his is valid, but it is only part of somebody's potential story. And if I wanted to write more of a broader audience, you know, then I feel like we would need to, you know, if I were to co-write it with him, but we would still need to do other people involved. And if I'm still involved with this, you know, does that count? Because it's not my story, even if I research that. I mean, we research other things, history and things like that, and that can be considered authentic or, you know, the getting it right idea. So why is it that for certain populations, we are considered that it's good enough to do for history, for example, that we can research and write something that's getting it right, but not for maybe a community that we're not part of? And you know, because I understand it's of course better if you can get an authentic story directly from somebody who's lived that experience, but I feel like other people have the potential to get it right if they put the effort in, and yet the reaction always seems to be that you can't, and I get frustrated by that. Sorry, that was really long and rambling.
So I think I would actually approach it a different way, which is that I think that your son's story is what people want to hear. And that is the valid story. I don't think you need to add, it depends on what kind of book you're writing, but if it's a book about your son, that is the story. Right. And it's the specificity of the story that actually makes it universal. And I think that is the power of our stories, is it actually doesn't need other people. His story is enough. And I think that's what's actually most important, is for people to hear his story, as being a trans person who's on the spectrum. That's a story that people want to know. There are other people who share that story. So that's what I would think about a bit more.
One of our students just suggested, and I thought a good idea, to tape conversations. In other words, not everything has to be done as typing, to tape conversations with your son. And that can be the beginning of a book. And also, yeah, as a memoir, as a nonfiction book, as an autobiography, that's his story. You're assisting him in whatever fashion in transmitting it, which is perfectly valid.
Yeah. All right, everybody, I'm so sorry to have to do this because this is an important and fascinating conversation, but we are going to have to wrap. So I'm going to throw it to Emil to kind of get us through closing, and then to Marie.
Oh, am I
I'm sorry.
wrapping
Sorry.
things up?
Yeah, sorry. I'm going to throw it to Marie
Okay.
for closing comments. We will keep the Zoom meeting open for another 30 minutes or so in case people want to stay around and have a conversation together.
Yeah, I think
So,
I saw some other questions. So
yeah,
maybe
we did.
yeah.
Some incredible questions. So Marie, take it away.
Okay, great. And thank you, Connie. Thank you, all of our speakers. This was truly what I think struck me the most is the complexity of the different levels of all of these really important. We really covered a lot of territory here today, but the complexity of these issues, there's no easy. And I loved how the speakers were willing to challenge one another and say, you know, wait a minute, this is my perspective, which is, of course, what we're here for, what it is. Why are we at Rutgers today to discuss these issues? It's to engage in this really deep intellectual activity of considering different perspectives, different points of view. How do we pay homage to all of these different perspectives from the different members of our community and their intersectionality and all of the wonderful myriad of complexity that we have. So I'm not saying too much. Again, we are at time. Connie has been keeping us all really well on time. I noticed that some people were actually entering the discussion a little bit on the late side. This is being recorded, and so Connie will be getting to everyone the link so that you can watch the whole thing in its fullness. I think it's wonderful that speakers are willing to stick around, if other people can stick around and continue this discussion and answer all of your questions. I myself have to leap to another Zoom meeting where it's really kind of crazy. I posted twice in the chat about the Banned Books event. You don't have to read if you don't want. You can just come, and we're having flash talks, and we're going to be featuring, Marc and Emil also from today's presentation. Again, everyone, be safe. Take care and really continue the conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you to the panel, MI Colloquium students. I will really look forward to reading your reflections on this one. And again, if you have any questions for the audience, let me share this real quickly with everyone. I have everyone's contact information here. So if you want to get in touch with the panelists, this is how you would do it. So with that, I'm going to say have a great day, and I'm going to turn off my camera and video, but I'll leave the room open, and anybody who wants to stay can unmute yourselves and have a conversation. So goodbye, everybody.
I would like to bring up the idea of self-publishing, which some people have mentioned. I did some research in this area with some colleagues, and it was on adult literature, not children's or adolescent. And
children's literature, as if, we're having this conversation about ethics and morals around representational justice, but sometimes I feel as though a moral purity can sort of come into play, in which, as I said in my question, marginalized characters are expected to act within some concept of moral purity. And if they fail to do that, if they fail to meet a standard of respectability politics, on social media especially, a book is sometimes sort of pushed out as just bad representation. So I guess I'm interested in this question in terms of respectability politics and, really what does good or bad representation mean?
I think something Emily said to me is really the heart of this. We need more books. We need more books with every kind of character. We need characters who are funny. I mean, one of the biggest absences in YA is there should be 10,000 funny YA books, dealing with the insanity of being an adolescent. And I think that when there's Walter Dean Myers, and then you have to wait a generation for Jason Reynolds, I know I'm over, then everybody's arguing about Monster. Monster, in my opinion, is one of the great, great achievements of our literature. But that's when you have Walter. When you have a shelf full of Walters of every type and description who are doing friendship novels and summer vacation novels and hard-hitting social protest novels and all of that, then this will dissipate somewhat. But right now, the individual book stands for too much. And I do think we will open up, we'll breathe a little more when there is more.
I mean, I think that's really true. We don't question necessarily the representation of a book about someone in the dominant culture, because we have multitudes of those books and we're getting so many different viewpoints, whereas we don't have as many books about representing people in non-dominant cultures. And so there's always this fear, is this the only book you're going to read about? And if so, how can it possibly present all viewpoints? And it can't. You know, if I tell my story, I can't possibly represent white women. You know, I just, you know, or white women academics or white women, whatever intersectionality you want me to be. And that's why, you know, it's doesn't seem to be a problem in dominant culture literature, but it does seem to be a problem in literature about diverse communities. And I use diverse in a much wider sense than race. But so I agree with Marc on that point, that it has to do with having a plethora of good literature out there for us to read.
Although I would also say there's something particular, and Emily probably can add to this. There is a particular history within certain African-American aesthetic about uplift the race. In other words, the narrative of uplift the race as an obligation has been around for a while. And depending who's speaking, they may more or less come from that as an understanding. You know, Debbie Taylor, the great librarian, would often talk about didacticism as something that she saw as more valued as an ethos within an African-American framework, as opposed to many white critics who would speak about aesthetics over didacticism. And so the point is, there are different narrative discussions in different communities about the obligations of literature.
Yeah, I was noticing, and I was gonna type, but I'm not going to now because it's easier to not. And to just draw attention to, Adara Scholl in the chat said, I feel that representation as a whole requires many voices, not just one or a few. It's frustrating as a minority to have so few voices holding the responsibility of an entire community's representation. The pressure is unfair, and I think it scares off potential authors. And I think that's a really important point, because we've talked even during this hour, right, about this pressure on people writing cross-culturally to get it right, and all the anxiety surrounding that. But we talk, I think, a lot less in the broader sort of academic discourse around this stuff and professional discourse around it, about the pressure to get it right for people who are writing about their own experiences, and how, you know, Emily, you were underscoring this point about specificity, that what gives these stories power is specificity. And it's sort of like you aren't allowed to tell a specific story in some sense, because you have to like carry the community with you into this story. You have to speak for everyone, and it's an enormous amount of epistemic and aesthetic pressure that I think is really it's counter to the whole larger project.
Yeah, I also want to speak to the issue of social media. It just makes everything. Emil, we got to write that paper about book people. It's just, you know, if you're thinking that your audience is the people on social media and Goodreads, it actually can keep you from writing the story that you want. That's not necessarily your audience. Your audience are often the people who are not doing all that. As upset as people were about American Dirt sold a lot of copies, right? The audience was actually something outside of this kind of insular argument that is taking place in these very interconnected communities. So I think that's one to think about if you're, especially if someone's thinking about writing a story like this, like that's actually not the audience, even though it can be very important in many ways. Your audience might actually just be the kids who are reading your book, who are not typing on Goodreads all the time. Yeah. So let's see. Place. Yeah, so I think economics makes a big difference. Mark and I talked about this a little bit yesterday as well, but I think that this is always in kind of a cycle. So what is selling is what people are picking to sell, and it's hard to get out of the cycle of what people think will. You just have to think more broadly. So I know a lot of you are going to be librarians, but some of you may want to go into publishing, right? And be that gatekeeper who picks the actual manuscript and says, we're going to push this, right? I think that's something else that we need to think about.
Yeah. You know, in terms of publishing, there is kind of that, it's an idea from critical race theory about, you know, the dominant culture is willing to work with the non-dominant culture as far as it will profit the dominant culture. You know, I don't know if I'm explaining that well enough, but and that in fact is the deal with book publishing. And there is a belief out there among many publishers that books with diverse characters or diverse protagonists, let me say that, won't sell as well as books with white protagonists. And that's, you know, then you go back into the whole book cover thing where even if a book has a diverse protagonist, the book covers are, you know, made in such a way that it's ambiguous or it's whitewash or the characters in silhouette or all of those things. And so there is that sense of what's actually being put out there, I think, is what Emily's talking about, is just a small subset of what is possible to be put out there. And that a lot of the, and I think, Mark, you said earlier, you know, book publishing is a business.
Although I would question something you said. I guess I would say, yes, I've seen that with book covers. And I can tell you, having worked in the industry for many years, that I absolutely heard people say in publishing meetings, blacks don't buy books. It was stated as a fact. So that has existed. I would say in the age of Jackie Woodson and Jason Reynolds and Angie Thomas, there is at least an awareness that there is a very popular strand within publishing of at least these key AAA level African-American authors and Jerry Pinkney and James Ransom and illustrators. So I don't think it's quite as straightforward as not believing that diverse books will sell. I think that's not accurate. I think it had been so. There was a time when, and this leads to this urban idea that you could only sell African-American books to libraries, that you couldn't sell them in retail.
Mark, I gotta tell you though, those myths around this are still pretty alive and well, at least in romance. This we had a dust up about this, and I mean, it's hard to. Now I have no sense of time. It was a couple years ago, maybe. I mean, there's been I shouldn't even call it a dust up. There's been an ongoing conversation around representation and romance, but that recently it was revealed that some publishers we're making these kinds of claims. I think we do have to wrap. I actually have to go.
We don't. I just have to wrap. So it has been
This is too fun. We have to go on. We have to do more.
It is really good. I did stop the recording for a while, but I restarted it over this last conversation. So I hope that was all right. But I'm going to sign off. So again, it was great. Thank you all very, very much. It was great colloquium. And I'm going to end, but Emil is now going to be the host, and he can stay on board just a little bit longer, I think. Or not.
I can stay on a moment.
All right. Well, actually, we'll go ahead and end it for everybody because it is at 1:30 already.
Yeah, we blasted through that.
We've had. It's very unusual for this many people to stay on for a full half hour after a program ends. So, kudos to the panelists. You guys really, really hit the mark tonight, today. So, thanks everybody, and I look forward to seeing everyone.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for coming.
Bye, everyone.
Leave?